Welcome to Human Monsters. Of all the crimes man can visit upon one another, the act of rape is the most feared and depraved. Although most perpetrators of rape are men and most victims are women and children, no one is exempt from becoming either a predator or the prey. Simply put, rape is the forceful sexual penetration of another person, whether it be anal, oral, or vaginal, without the consent of the recipient. As humans, and unlike any other animals, we were born with the knowledge of right and wrong. Within each of us there is a moral compass, which is sharpened by learning from a very young age what is right and what is wrong. We are only human, and due to our flawed nature, the urge to break the law in order to fulfill a primal desire is often much stronger than the pole of the needle pointing in the right direction. Every now and then, however, an individual is born into this world that lacks that moral compass people depend on so much to stay out of trouble. It is as if his compass has no magnet and no true north, and as long as the individual can satisfy their basest desires, no consequences or moral implications matter. Anyone deeply submerged in the true crime genre will know that rape is a massive worldwide problem. In 2020, the World Health Organization estimated that South Africa is the country with the highest statistics of rape internationally. It's followed by Lesotho, Botswana, and a host of other third world countries. Amongst these nations, some have reported that a minimum of 75% of people have been raped during the course of their lives. In interviews with random men, at least 1 in 4 admitted to having raped a woman or child. Statistics show that only 9% of rape charges ever go to trial, and of those, only 3% of perpetrators are convicted. Needless to say, it's impossible to know for sure how many people are actually raped daily, since the majority of incidents are not reported. Often the victim knows the perpetrator, and the fear and shame becomes too much to bear. Victims are often victimized again at police stations by inexperienced police officers, and victim shaming is not unheard of. Then there are the very long, drawn-out, and invasive rape kit examination. Indeed, for a third time you might feel violated all over again. The wheels of justice grind slowly, and the court proceedings can take months, even years, depending on where you live. Most people just want to forget and move on. Who can blame them? Every day you don't have closure is a day you relive an incident that changed your life forever. Today I want to tell you about a criminal that, despite the fact that he never has been convicted of killing anyone, is one of the worst monsters in the world. Stumbling upon this story, I just knew that, despite the little information out there, this is a tale that needed to be told. His ability to blend into a minute community successfully while committing his crimes makes him both interesting and terrifying. This is the story about a sexual predator called the Beast of Jersey. The Isle of Jersey is a jewel in the English Channel. It's only about 45 square kilometers, and at most hosts about 55,000 residents. Although it's the isle closest to France, it's constitutionally bound by England, and English is the main language of locals. It's easy to compare the community on the isle with that of any small town or hamlet. Folks there have roots generations deep. That is why, when a series of violent rapes occurred over a period of 11 years, it was inconceivable that someone on the island could be responsible, Everyone was convinced it was a stranger who had traveled by ferry to the idyllic little rock to steal the virtue and murder the innocents of 11 victims. There was no way to tell that the evil that terrified locals came from within. It's documented that the Beast of Jersey exercised his reign of terror for 11 years, but this disgusting pervert had his first go at crime during 1957 when he attacked a 29-year-old nurse who was waiting at a bus stop. He dragged her into a field and viciously raped her. The assault was so severe, she needed stitches. November 1958. He attacked a woman late at night at a bus stop. He once again violently raped the 20-year-old woman, but this time he wore a mask. July 1959. He grabbed a 31-year-old woman on her way to a bus stop and again repeated his depraved ritual to satisfy his sadistic sexual proclivities. The aforementioned 3 attacks had fed the beast enough that for a year there was no activity. August 1959. The beast felt that old familiar hunger pang, and he attacked a 28-year-old woman. But she put up a fight. She gave the baffled police the best description so far. Her attacker was in his 40s. He wore a musty thigh-length coat, and he spoke in an Irish accent. It would later be determined that he faked this accent in order to confuse police. As with some of his previous attacks, she also stated that he tied a rope around her neck and bound her hands behind her head. He was, however, getting bored with his choice of victim, and as we've seen many times in serial crimes, once a certain level of ecstasy is reached, they need a bigger fix to get high. The Beast of Jersey shifted gears. Valentine's Day, 1960. He attacked an 8-year-old boy. The child was sleeping in his room, and he was awoken by what he surely must have assumed was the monster from his nightmares. A rope was tied around his neck, and the boy was dragged to a field where he was raped. The monster had upped his game and was now not just kidnapping and violating his victims. His victims were now much younger, and he was prepared to break into houses to get what he wanted. March 1960. The beast drove past a 25-year-old woman on her way to a bus stop. He offered her a lift. His tall tale about being a doctor and on his way to fetch his wife convinced her to get into the Rover he was driving. The young woman trusted her instincts, and soon after entering the car, she asked to be let out. Her kidnapper responded by punching her in the face. He drove to a deserted area. She was raped, but finally got away. Late March, a 34-year-old single mother was sleeping in her isolated cottage when her phone started ringing in the middle of the night. She picked up, but the line went dead. She went back to bed and fell back asleep. About an hour later, she heard something downstairs and went to investigate, thinking that perhaps it was her 15-year-old daughter who was awake. As she descended the landing, the lights went out. She went to the phone, feeling that something was wrong, and found that the phone lines had been cut. The beast attacked her, but at that moment, the woman's 15-year-old daughter came downstairs to see what all the noise was about. The woman took the opportunity to escape and ran to her nearest neighbor. When she got help and returned to her cottage, she found her daughter had been viciously raped. The Beast of Jersey tried to attack a 14-year-old girl in her bed, but her screams chased the coward away. By now he had a full costume in which he would approach his victims. He wore a wig with wiry locks, a terrifying mask he would later admit to having made himself, and an old, musty-smelling coat with nails protruding from the cuffs, collar, and lapels. He carried a flashlight that had been modified to give more of a concentrated beam. July 1960. The Beast wore his horrifying costume as he kidnapped and raped an 8-year-old boy. For a short period of time, the Beast went dormant. 1961. His reign of terror started all over again with the rape and kidnapping of a 12-year-old boy, an 11-year-old boy, and an 11-year-old girl. I cannot imagine being that young, fast asleep in your bed, being awoken by this madman, and then being savagely sexually assaulted by this monster. We will definitely have photos of this macabre costume on all our social media sites, and, as always, we invite your comments and feedback. All his young victims were removed from their homes in the middle of the night. Finally, the local police were prepared to admit that this was out of their league. They contacted Scotland Yard, and the highly acclaimed Detective Superintendent Jack Manning was sent to the island. Manning had a gut feeling the culprit was one of the locals. He requested that all men should not only submit their fingerprints, but that all men convicted of serious crimes should be interviewed. It would later emerge that the Beast was one of the 13 men who did not give his fingerprints, and since his only crime for which he spent a month in jail as a juvenile was stealing food for the poor during the German invasion amid the Second World War, he stayed well under the radar. An identikit was compiled, and the height of the rapist was estimated at about 5'6". He seemed to only operate when the moonlight was bright, and would only hunt between the hours of 10 p.m. and 3 a.m. Some of the victims would tell police that he spoke of his wife and a mother who was an alcoholic, and would complain that he had dropped his lighter or his cigarettes. Later, investigators would discover that the Beast was not a smoker, and that these little snippets of information were utilized to confuse the police. Although the authorities seemed to be no closer to finding the perpetrator, it did result in a 2-year hiatus. Just as citizens thought they were safe, the attacks would resume. April 1963. The Beast could no longer contain his disgusting urges, and he attacked a 9-year-old boy. November. An 11-year-old boy fell victim to a similar assault. It was during one of these attacks that the Beast mentioned he had killed before, but frankly, even after the arrest had been made, no evidence to affirm this statement could be found. April 1964. He attacked a 10-year-old girl. August. He attacked a 16-year-old boy. As is often the case when people are desperate to find the identity of a criminal, an innocent man was accused of the crimes. Unfortunately for him, after he was proven to be innocent, his house was set on fire, and he had to leave the island for his own personal safety. The poor fisherman was targeted because, like the unknown suspect, he wore a thigh-length coat which he tied with a rope. He was also seen as a bit of an eccentric character who would keep odd hours and lived like a hermit. In 1966, the Beast of Jersey did what many other offenders would do. He wrote this letter to the editor of the local newspaper. My dear sir, I think that it is just the time to tell you that you are just wasting your time, as every time I have done what I always intended to do, and remember it will not stop at this, but I will be fair to you and give you a chance. I have never had much out of this life, but I intend to get everything I can now. I have always wanted to do the perfect crime. I have done this, but this time let the moon shine very bright in September, because this time it must be perfect. Not one, but two. I am not a maniac by a long shot, but I like to play with you people. You will hear from me before September, and I will give you all the clues, just to see if you can catch me. Yours very sincerely, Wait and See. All police could discern from this letter was that it was littered with spelling mistakes. The arrogance of the letter concerned police enough for efforts to be increased, but to no avail. August 1966, the Beast kidnapped a 15-year-old girl, bound her, and raped her. Not heeding his warning, the girl tried to escape. This infuriated the monster, and as he choked her, he uttered the following chilling words. I told you not to do anything stupid. Do you know how long it takes a woman? About 5 minutes. The girl was located and found to have long, even gashes on her torso, as if an animal had clawed at her. Once again, the Beast went quiet. April 1970. The Beast kidnapped a 13-year-old boy, raped him, and left the same marks on the boy as he had on his previous victims. He told the boy that if he told anyone, he would kill both his parents. July 10th, 1971. The end was in sight. 2 on-duty policemen noticed a suspicious vehicle and tried to flag down the Morris saloon the motorist was driving. To their surprise, the car sped off, driving erratically. After crashing through a hedge and getting stuck in a tomato field, the driver jumped out and began to run, only to be rugby tackled by one of the arresting officers. The man was taken into custody. Only once in the light of the police station did officers get a clear look at the man's outfit. He wore a very old coat, had gloves on, and carried with him the musty smell so many victims had reported. His explanation for his attempted escape was equally bizarre. He told police that he belonged to an underground group, and the reason he was speeding away was that he was late for, of all things, an orgy. After searching his person, police found all the evidence they needed to confidently say they had in their custody the Beast of Jersey. In his pockets, he had the familiar wig, the mask, a torch that had been modified, and 2 lengths of rope. When asked why he had spikes protruding from his lapels and cuffs, he explained that it was for his own protection, in case he was attacked by someone who knew martial arts. His strange explanations led investigators to probe even deeper into his life, and once a search of his home was done, there was no doubt about whom they had in custody. Edward Painel was indeed the Beast of Jersey. Edward Painel was a native of the Isle of Jersey. He was born into an affluent family with good standing in the community in 1925. He was married to a woman called Joan, for whom he did handiwork at one of the children's homes she owned. About a year after her husband was convicted of the crimes he was accused of, Joan would write a book about her time with Painel, and she complained of his low sex drive. Uncle Ted, as he was known, was a well-liked character and would often treat the kids to candy and other treats. He even played the role of Santa Claus. Many years later, over 100 children would claim to have suffered sexual abuse at the hands of staff, including Painel, at the children's homes. It was said that he would sneak into the dorms at night, prowling the gallery. All children would see was the frightening dark figure and the beady eyes of a man lurking in the shadows. He was described as a loner and a free spirit with a very uneventful youth. He mostly worked as a handyman, but later branched out into construction. He had one daughter with Joan, and after they married, he adopted her 2 daughters from her previous marriage. The union was, however, merely a legal formality. The couple fought frequently, and it would not be unheard of for Painel to come and go as he pleased. He often made no contact with his family for days on end. According to Joan, he was one of the most outspoken people on the island with regards to the crimes of the Beast of Jersey. Painel's downfall was the annex he added to their house. It contained a study and lounge area, but it was what police found behind a hidden door that led to a small room that truly sealed his fate. The moment the door was opened, the musty smell hit the officers. Old clothing hung from hangers. Painel was clearly a student of the occult, since officers took into evidence a curved sword, various books on the occult, and documented the small altar Painel had assembled. The clothing presented with semen stains. Painel even had false eyebrows to incorporate into his disguise. The final nail in his coffin came when a massive amount of photos of not only his victims, but also their homes, were discovered. It was clear that the Beast of Jersey had been stalking his prey for months before every attack. Painel seemed to also have a fascination with Gilles de Rais, a 15th century nobleman in France. De Rais was a general in the army of Joan of Arc, and although he was born into immense wealth, he married even richer, and it is speculated that after the death of Joan of Arc, he was getting bored with his life of luxury. He took up alchemy, which during that period was viewed as witchcraft. It was reported that he tried to summon the demon Baron, but failed, believing the reason being that he needed to sacrifice the soul of a young child. He was eventually charged with the murder of 140 children and swiftly executed after his trial. The trial went quickly. Painel was indicted with 13 counts of sexual assault, sodomy, and rape against 5 victims. He was soon sentenced to 30 years in prison. 1991. Edward Painel was released on good behavior after spending 20 years in prison. In a very stupid move, he returned to the Isle of Jersey, but the community had neither forgiven nor forgotten the despicable crimes he committed, and he was swiftly chased off the island. 1994. The year of Edward Painel's death. Although Edward Painel died almost 3 decades ago, the acts of depravity he visited upon his victims, most of whom were children, would live long in the memories of the afflicted. We know 11 of his victims, but so much research has been done that the number must undoubtedly be higher. Rape is a crime that has more to do with control and power than with sex, and Edward Painel clearly tried every conceivable way to create the most horrific scenes for his victims. Listeners, the crime of rape is never over just because the act is completed. The assault will stay with the victim for the rest of their lives. If you are a victim of sexual assault, I implore you to talk to someone. This is one secret that will destroy you if you do not share it, and there are many resources that can help you cope with the aftermath. You also have a responsibility not to turn a blind eye if you suspect someone might be abused. Don't go on a witch hunt, but if you see something, say something. If you recall, I mentioned the children's home with the frightening figure that would stalk the halls of the home to scare and terrify orphans and abandoned youths who already had their hopes and dreams shattered. It's said, but never confirmed, that Jimmy Savile also used to love terrorizing the youngest of the vulnerable sector. He creeped around at night, looking for victims in the same place as the Beast of Jersey. You will find a full episode in this feed on this monster who never was held accountable for his crimes. It's been a while, so you might have to scroll down quite a bit, but once you are familiar with this episode, you will agree that it is very possible that a monster like he also haunted the halls of sleeping children at night. As I conclude this episode, I am once again struck by the fact that the actual number of victims is still unknown. After an episode like this one, I wish we could highlight so many more victims in our podcast, Children of the Void. Bonnie Lee and I host the podcast, and we would like to take this opportunity to invite you to have a listen to our passion project. Before I sign off, I would also like to thank all of you for the tremendous support you have shown for Human Monsters. We love interacting with you through our groups, and as long as there are human monsters walking this earth, the team and I will be telling not just their stories, but also those of the victims who turned into victors. John Reginald Halliday Christie was born in Halifax, England, on April 8, 1899. His father was a carpet designer who was remembered for being cold and distant, apparently almost completely devoid of emotion. He barely even spoke. He ran his household with an iron fist, and his children were severely punished for any misdeed, no matter how minor. John was the sixth child, followed by another, and the only boy. When his father wasn't home, the household was dominated by females, both in number and spirit. John's mother was smothering and overprotective of him. Combined with being dominated by his sisters, the dynamic of John's early life was damaging to his self-esteem. John's grandfather passed away when John was 8 years old, and it would prove to be a pivotal event in John's life. John was given the option of seeing his grandfather's corpse at the funeral and wake. When he had a look at his grandfather's remains, something changed within him. His grandfather was an imposing and frightful man. Now the threat was literally dead. He no longer had a reason to fear this man, and it left a long-lasting impression on him. Death is the great cure-all, the most effective problem solver of all, especially when your problem is embodied as a human being. While most people would feel uneasy in the presence of the dead, John felt at peace. He left relieved. The dead can be controlled. They stay wherever they are, and they meddle not in the affairs of the living. John left school at age 15. He began working as an assistant projectionist at the local movie theater. He was known among his associates of comparable age to have trouble with the act of coitus. He failed to follow through on his first few tries. It is not known whether it was due to impotence, but he acquired monikers like Reggie No Dick and Can't Do It Christie. These names stuck with him throughout his adolescence and into his early 20s. It also didn't help that he wasn't particularly attractive. He was a redhead with pale blue eyes and an unusually large forehead, like the Frankenstein's monster. Certainly nobody shells out thousands of dollars for plastic surgery to look like that. As if it weren't bad enough that he was unattractive physically, some of his behavior was off-putting. He was a hypochondriac who faked illnesses to attract attention. It was the only way to control the spotlight and influence the people who populated his orbit. At the outbreak of World War I, John enlisted in the army and served as an infantryman. Later he worked as a signalman. There were no reports of transgressive or concerning behavior in his military record. When John was discharged, he noted that he was a victim of a mustard gas attack that left him temporarily blinded, though the latter point was never documented. It is assumed, however, that he never was blinded and was able to go on with his life successfully after he was discharged. Strangely, he claimed that the gas robbed him of his ability to speak at a normal volume. It was diagnosed as hysterical muteness, and it lasted for 3 years. During that time, he spoke at the decibel of a whisper. Many people he knew believed he never had this condition, that it was his latest ploy to become the center of attention. John met a woman named Ethel Waddington Simpson from Sheffield. They married on May 10th, 1920, at the registry office. It would become a troubled union, replete with sexual dysfunction and illicit conduct. After 4 years of matrimony, they separated and John moved to London. Ethel and John would reconcile years later, around 1934. This was after John had been in and out of prison. They moved to a new apartment in 1937 in a then dodgy part of London called Ladbroke Grove. By the time December 1938 rolled around, they moved to the downstairs apartment. The conditions of these apartments were squalid. There was one outdoor toilet for all the occupants to use. It also didn't help that an above-ground train rumbled by on a regular basis. Nevertheless, the couple went about their lives and made the most of it. John Christie was still impotent. Before and after his time in the military, his soldier would not salute. He was always out of ammo. He had no cue to hit the 8-ball, so he was always pushing rope. You get the picture. It was certainly no asset in his marriage. A complicating factor was the genesis of his sexual dysfunction. As a child, he often found himself attracted to his older sisters. In his distorted perspective, they taunted and teased him with their bodies deliberately. This was highly unlikely, but they were domineering, always ordering him around. He was torn when it came to them. Sexual attraction on one hand, resentment and hatred on the other. Naturally, this was delusional thinking. The last thing his sisters wanted was to have sex with their own brother. He came to despise women. With every failed attempt at sexual intercourse, the hatred would fester and swell as it blossomed as violent fantasies that begged to be manifested, like mushrooms growing from cow shit. The way he saw it, it was their fault that he could not perform. Did the invention and marketing of Viagra spare the world another John Christie? He did a little better with prostitutes. It was outside the framework of an intimate relationship where he could develop and sustain an erection. It was really hard, difficult. April 12, 1921. The first of John Christie's crimes was for theft of postal orders during the time he worked as a mailman. He was sentenced to 3 months in prison. January 1923. John Christie was sentenced to 12 months of probation for obtaining money under false pretenses and violence. September 1924, He was charged with 2 counts of larceny. He was sentenced to 9 months imprisonment. After his release from prison, he began living with a prostitute. He assaulted her one day, which led to him being sentenced to 6 months of hard labor in May 1929. This was his most violent crime yet. He hit her on the head with a cricket bat. It was likely the most interesting thing ever done with a cricket bat. Sure enough, the magistrate called it a, quote, murderous attack. Little did he know that it was only a harbinger of things to come. Christie's criminal activity would resume in 1933. He had become friends with a priest, but the priest would become a victim of Christie's dubious idea of friendship. John stole his car. He was charged and convicted for theft and spent the next 3 months in prison. Criminals with low self-esteem are not troubled by the occasional brief stint in prison. They don't value themselves or their lives. So if they got tossed in a bin with the rest of society's garbage, it doesn't strike them as some kind of injustice. Also, many accept it as part of the criminal life. When World War II broke out in 1939, John Christie volunteered to play a role in fighting the Nazis. He became a member of the War Reserve Police. Had they examined his criminal record, they would have rejected him, but they needed as many men as they could get, so they likely skipped over that part of the screening process. He became a special constable and was based at the Harrow Road Police Station. He served in this capacity for the following 4 years, a position he held longer than any other job, and he enjoyed his work. He was so strict about upholding the law that he was deemed by locals as the, quote, Himmler of Rillington Place, a reference to one of the Nazis' most overzealous and aggressive administrators of military and government protocol. He loved the power and authority that came with the uniform, and he wielded it whenever it was appropriate. Occasionally, he abused the power the position bestowed upon him. For instance, he began to stalk women under the guise of performing his duties as an officer. He kept notes on the women. He drilled a hole in his kitchen door so that he could use it as a peephole to spy on his neighbors. He was never caught. 1934, John Christie resigned from his position as special constable. It is unknown why he would leave a position he enjoyed so much, especially since it gave him an opportunity to lord power and control over others, which he greatly enjoyed. Christie took a job at a radio factory working as a clerk. John Christie developed a love of gas, the kind that is used within the framework of medical procedures. He would tell people that he used it for those purposes. He would tell people it would cure their bronchitis, for instance. He would tell people that in his position as special constable, he acquired a great deal of medical knowledge. He would claim that it endowed him with the ability to perform abortions. Abortion was illegal in England at that time, so it was always a lucrative, even if illegal, pursuit. 1948. A couple moved into the top-level apartment above John and Ethel. Their names were Timothy and Beryl Evans. Timothy was borderline mentally disabled. He was also physically disabled and demonstrated problem behavior due to his mental deficiencies. Beryl was only slightly better off intellectually than Timothy. She struggled with housework and did not manage their finances well. One day Timothy's sister Geraldine visited the couple, as she had been helping them with home improvements. She felt uncomfortable with John Christie when she met him. He walked in unbidden and offered her a cup of tea. She said it appeared he had no intention of leaving. She told him Timothy would return soon. That did the trick. John finally left. Timothy and Beryl struggled with their marriage and child. His earnings were not enough to pay for all their expenses, and, both being of low intelligence, they struggled to keep their lives together. They were also very emotional and frequently got into arguments that culminated in physical violence. Given these conditions, Beryl decided when she got pregnant a second time that there was no way she could take care of a second child. She could barely keep her home clean and tidy. November 8th, 1948. Timothy came home to find that his wife and child were missing. John came to his door and informed him that he performed an abortion on Beryl and there were complications. He said she developed septic poisoning when she tried some home remedies to induce a miscarriage. He said she died in the middle of the abortion. Being of such low mental caliber, Timothy didn't question this. He stayed with an aunt in Wales for a while. Timothy's mother found John Christie's explanation questionable and suspicious. She wondered how both Beryl and Geraldine, who had moved in to provide assistance to Beryl in everyday life, could be dead. His mother convinced him to report the incident to the police, which he did on November 30th. Timothy tried to protect John by telling lies. He said he accidentally killed Beryl by giving her pills to induce an abortion. He told police he disposed of her body by depositing it in a sewer drain. The police did not find the body in question in the sewer drain. Under further interrogation, he admitted he lied and that John Christie was involved in Beryl's death. When searching the house in which John and Ethel Christie resided, the police discovered a notable object in the laundry room that had been placed behind some wood. It was wrapped in a tablecloth and tied up with cord. Ethel insisted she had never seen it before. The investigators removed the bindings. 2 feet fell out of the tablecloth. It was the body of Beryl Evans. They searched the rest of the room. They found the body of Geraldine under another pile of wood behind the door. According to their observations, both women had been strangled with a man's necktie. It was still wrapped around Geraldine's neck. Timothy claimed in a confession to have killed Beryl. He later recanted and insisted that it was John Christie who killed her. Timothy alternated between these two versions of the event so many times, he was entirely devoid of credibility. January 11th, 1950. Timothy was put on trial for the murder of Geraldine. That murder was considered to be the more heinous of the two, and the condemnation he would face for his actions was guaranteed to be more severe, whether he was truly guilty or not. The prosecutor's argument against Timothy's innocence was informed by John Christie's testimony as a chief witness, despite Christie having been accused by Timothy of being the perpetrator. The purpose of prosecuting Geraldine's murder was that Beryl's was considered to be caused by provocation, and under those circumstances, the charge could be reduced to manslaughter. The murder of Geraldine was considered to be more cold-blooded, almost without a motive, and the charge could not be reduced from murder. Timothy's lawyer failed him. They didn't investigate the case. They didn't even look into John Christie's criminal history. Had they done so, they would have taken reasonable doubt into consideration. A statement was taken from Ethel Christie. It was considered to be improbable. She said she always got her household water from the laundry room, where the corpses were found. The police didn't see how she could miss the stench of the decaying bodies. A dog resided on the property, and she said the dog didn't smell the odor of putrefaction either. She would later change her story, claiming that she never went into the laundry room, not even once. Somehow the inconsistency of her statements went unnoticed. Timothy would go on to claim that he feared the police would beat him if he didn't confess to the murders. His attorney didn't use the allegedly false confession to Timothy's advantage. John Christie was the crown witness. He referred to himself as a victim and a hero. He made sure to mention his military record from the war and the physical disabilities he allegedly suffered as a result. He wanted to convince the court that he had done all his killing during the war in battle. An attorney brought up John's criminal record. It didn't accomplish much. Christie hadn't been arrested in 17 years. After just 40 minutes of deliberation, the jury found Timothy guilty of the murder of Geraldine. He was sentenced to death. When John heard Timothy was to face death, he began to cry. Timothy would file appeals. As he did so, he insisted that John Christie murdered both Beryl and Geraldine. His appeals failed. March 9th, 1950. Timothy Evans was hanged. John Christie has been confirmed as the murderer of 8 known victims. It is suspected that he could have killed more. August 16th, 1943. Ruth Foerst, 21 years old, met John Christie. She was a migrant worker from Austria. She was employed at a munitions factory. To make ends meet, she worked part-time as a prostitute. John said he met her at Ladbroke Grove while she was soliciting potential clients in a snack bar. He invited her to go to his home. Ethel was away at the time. John strangled Ruth mid-coitus. He hid her body beneath the floorboards in the living room initially. Later, he moved her remains to the garden out back. 1944. John met 32-year-old Muriel Amelia Eady while working at the radio factory. She was said to suffer from bronchitis. John convinced her that he had a cure for the condition, and this he used to lure her to his apartment. Ethel was not at home. He gave Muriel a substance called Friar's Balsam. In truth, he only used it to conceal the smell of the gas he would have her inhale. As she inhaled it, he connected a second tube to the gas tap. She soon became unconscious. The gas he administered contained a high level of carbon monoxide. Christie raped Muriel while she was passed out. Once she finished, he strangled her to death as a second climax. He sure didn't have trouble getting it up in this circumstance. He buried Ruth's body in the back garden. December 6, 1952. John resigned from his job. December 14, 1952. John murdered Ethel. He strangled her while she was in bed. He placed her body underneath the floorboards of the parlor. He wrapped her remains in a blanket. John struggled to find a new job. He sold many of his possessions to help make ends meet. He also sold Ethel's wedding ring. He concocted several different stories to explain Ethel's disappearance. He told her relatives that she could no longer write letters due to rheumatism. He told others that she was away visiting relatives, which they believed because it was something she did frequently while she was still alive. Still struggling financially, he forged Ethel's signature and withdrew everything from her bank account, since his unemployment benefits were inadequate to cover his living expenses. 25-year-old Rita Nelson was an Irish immigrant. She was unwedded and pregnant, a highly stigmatized position to be in at the time. January 19, 1953. Though she was supposed to go to a hospital about her pregnancy, Rita was sitting in a pub with her sister. John Christie happened to be nearby, and he overheard her conversation about her pregnancy. Noting that she was distressed about the situation, he offered to perform an abortion. She was 24 weeks in, but she agreed to go to Christie's home. It is surprising that she didn't turn around and run after getting a look at the squalid conditions of Christie's domicile. Not only was the apartment filthy and cluttered, but a putrid stench befouled the air. She was desperate, so the condition of the apartment was not enough to dissuade her from undergoing the procedure. John had her sit on a chair in the kitchen. He approached her with a jar of liquid he claimed was an anesthetic. He told her to inhale the fumes. As she did so, he held the gas hose close to her face. She soon became unconscious. Christie raped her while she was passed out. He finished by strangling her to death using a cord. John faced the threat of being caught if he dug a hole in his backyard. He was at a loss for ideas on where to bury Rita's body. He meditated over this after leaving her on the kitchen floor and retired to bed. He resolved to find a solution in the morning. The next day, Christie decided that the most sensible place to deposit Rita's remains was a small pantry that was hidden behind a cupboard. He put a cloth over her head and tied it tight. He tied a cord around her ankles. He dressed her and placed a cloth between her legs. He propped her upside down in the pantry. 26-year-old Kathleen Maloney met John Christie in December of 1952. She had entertained him in a room where another prostitute was present. He had taken pornographic photos of the other woman. When he joined her and a friend at a cafe, they discussed their search for a new apartment. Christie lured them to his place, possibly under the pretense of telling them there was a vacancy on the property. Kathleen accompanied him to his home. Kathleen was inebriated at the time, and therefore it took little effort for John to bring her to the chair in the kitchen and administer the gas. Once she had passed out, he tied a rope around her neck and strangled her to death while raping her. He removed her white vest and put it between her legs. He left her sitting on the chair overnight as he slept. In the morning, he wrapped Kathleen's body in a blanket, wrapping it around her feet with a sock. He put a pillowcase over her head and tied it in place using another sock. She was put in the pantry next to Rita. For reasons that remain unknown, he tossed ashes and dirt over Kathleen's body. It was probably because he was insane. 26-year-old Hectorina McLennan met John Christie at a cafe. She and her boyfriend Alex were homeless. They would sleep wherever they could. After meeting John a few times at a pub, they accepted his offer of accommodations. They found the conditions of his apartment off-putting, being sparsely furnished, not to mention the stomach-churning stench. They endured it for a few days and then left. March 5th, 1953. John got together with Hectorina and Alex at the labor exchange when he went there to collect his unemployment benefits. He persuaded Hectorina to go home with him while leaving Alex behind. John gave Hectorina a beverage. He assumed she was sufficiently distracted and tried to place the gas tube near her head. It didn't work. She became alarmed and ran from the kitchen. John grabbed her and choked her until she passed out. He propped her up in the kitchen chair and gassed her until she became completely unconscious. He put her on the floor and wrapped a section of cord around her neck. He strangled and raped her at the same time. Hectorina's wrists were bound using a handkerchief. The only clothing she wore at this point were a sweater and a white jacket. He dragged her across the floor to the pantry cupboard. He left her in a sitting position against the door. To keep her from falling backwards, he hooked her bra to the blanket that was used to cover Kathleen Maloney's legs. Alex would go to John's apartment looking for Hectorina. John said he hadn't seen her. He invited Alex in for a cup of tea. The pungent aroma was still present. Alex took a pass on that. Margaret Forrest is the one victim who is known to have escaped from the clutches of John Christie. She mentioned that she suffered from migraine headaches, and he claimed he had coal gas, which he said would alleviate the pain. She didn't show up at the agreed-upon time. John was furious. Margaret was lucky. March 20th. A Mrs. Riley was invited to John Christie's apartment. She was looking for a place to live. Much to Christie's dismay, she arrived with a husband. He offered to sublet his place. Despite the condition of the place, with it being filthy and the nauseating smell, they agreed to rent the fixer-upper. The landlord dropped by that evening and was shocked to find the Rileys living there. Subletting was illegal, and he gave them until the following morning to leave. Beresford Brown lived on the top floor. He would use John Christie's kitchen since his was inoperable. March 24th. Beresford tried to attach brackets to the wall of the kitchen so that he could place his radio there. After knocking on several spots to find the ideal location, he was surprised to hear a hollow sound. He peeled the wallpaper back and discovered a door. There was a small crack in the door. When he shone a light through the crack, he was alarmed by what he saw. Brown notified the police immediately. They didn't need further prompting to search the place. The murders of Beryl and Geraldine Evans were still fresh in their minds. Representatives of local police, Scotland Yard, and a coroner were dispatched to the scene. When they pried the door open, they were greeted by the sight of a woman's body sitting with her back facing them. There was rubble by her feet. They spotted a large object behind her that was wrapped in a blanket. The first body was transferred to the front room and examined by the coroner. She was found to have been strangled. This body was fairly well preserved due to the cool temperature in the room. They discovered the third corpse, and all three were brought to the morgue for further analysis. While searching the rest of the apartment, one of the officers tripped on a loose floorboard. After removing the floorboards, they dug down through some rubble until they found a fourth female body. As investigators searched the backyard, they spotted a human femur leaning against a wooden fence. They dug in the garden and found more bones. The bones were black, which led to speculation that they may have been burned. Only one skull was found in the backyard, but due to the combined number of bones, the coroner determined that 2 bodies had been buried. Some other strange discoveries were made. A man's suit was found under the floorboards of the common hall. Nobody knew who it belonged to and why it was concealed beneath the floor. In the kitchen, they found a man's necktie that had been tied into a reef knot. It was the same type of knot that was used to strangle the dead women. Stranger still was a tobacco can that contained a collection of pubic hair. The hair was analyzed by the coroner and found to have been extracted from female bodies. They were not taken from the dead bodies found on the property. The police now began their search for John Christie. Christie was on the lam. He never slept at any one place for long. He used fake identities and changed his wardrobe. He also wore a hat to conceal his large forehead. He was identified by a police officer near the River Thames and was taken into custody. During questioning, Christie initially denied having committed murder. Eventually, he confessed to killing the 4 women who were found in the house. He attempted to shift the blame to the victims. He claimed Ethel began to choke in her sleep and that he put her out of her misery by choking her with a stocking. He further said that the medication he took for insomnia was gone and assumed she used the pills to commit suicide. He said that some of the other tenants were Jamaican and had been harassing her. He left her in the bed for a few days before placing her under the floorboards in the front room. He insisted this was a, quote, mercy killing. They didn't buy it. The fact that he strangled her was considered an admission of having committed murder. He accused Rita Nelson of trying to extort money from him and even went as far as to force her way into his home. He claimed that, during a struggle, she tried to hit him with a frying pan and then she fell back onto a chair. He said he saw some rope on a chair before blacking out. When he woke, he saw she had been strangled. He said it was accidental, that she did it to herself by landing on the rope. He didn't sell himself as a person who was shocked by the death when he said that he soon made a cup of tea and sat down to enjoy it. As far as Kathleen Maloney's death was concerned, he claimed she made sexual advances on him, which he rebuffed, and she retaliated. He claimed to have a fuzzy memory and that the next thing he knew, she was dead. He also cast blame on Hectorina McLennan for what he had done to her. He claimed she became hostile when he decided to kick her and her boyfriend out. He claimed that when she fell to the floor during the struggle, her clothing became wrapped around her neck and strangled her. According to John Christie, Ruth Fuerst also had it coming. He admitted to utilizing her services as a prostitute. He claimed that she begged him to leave his wife. They had intercourse one last time, whereupon he strangled her. He insisted that Muriel Eady was also sexually aggressive toward him. He seemed to be quite fond of characterizing himself as irresistible to women, with them throwing themselves at him. He killed her after Ethel found out about their affair, executing her using the gas. John Christie was not popular in prison. He boasted about his crimes, comparing himself to another serial killer of women, John George Haig. He would tell them it was his objective to outdo Haig in body count. He intended to murder 12 women, double that of Haig. During the trial, John Christie was more forthcoming about the method of execution, admitting that he killed the women in accordance with the coroner's findings. He denied that he was a necrophile, though raping a woman while she is being killed is considered to be a form of necrophilia. The confession that shocked the most was his account of killing Beryl Evans. As with the other murders, he tried to depict himself as a victim, but nobody was convinced of this. The justice system tried to have the aforementioned information blocked, as they were anxious to avoid their role in sending an innocent man to the gallows. Christie claimed that he walked into Beryl's apartment as she was about to commit suicide with the coal gas. She was deeply depressed about being pregnant out of wedlock with no support. Christie said she begged him to kill her, whereupon he gassed and strangled her. Christie was evaluated by psychiatrists and found to be sane and fit to stand trial. June 22, 1953, the day John Christie's trial began. The focus of the trial was the murder of Ethel. The prosecutor felt this charge was the most important because there was more evidence, and therefore conviction was more likely. He was also charged with the murder of Kathleen, Hectorina, and Rita, but the court decided to bring those cases to trial at a later date. John entered a plea of guilty by reason of insanity. He was unable to hire a lawyer with his own funds, so he was provided with a public defender. You get what you pay for, and his attorney took the tack of providing all the evidence of the murders as a tactic to prove that John Christie was indeed insane. It is not normally a strategy a lawyer would use. The insanity defense still didn't work. A psychiatrist testified that Christie was unable to recognize that his actions regarding rape and murder were illegal and wrong. This theory didn't hold up when considering that Christie expended a considerable effort to hide his crimes from the world. If he truly had no conception of right and wrong, he would have left the corpses in full view of all visitors to his home. Christie took the stand, which was a serious mistake. While cross-examined by the prosecutor, he was nervous, fidgety, and perspiring. The trial was over after 4 days. The jury deliberated for 85 minutes. The verdict: guilty. He was sentenced to death. During the time when the death penalty existed in England, it was carried out swiftly after sentencing. John Christie's hanging was scheduled for July 15th, 1953. John Christie was hung. According to reporters, about 200 people gathered outside of the prison, apparently in a festive mood, as they anticipated that the justice system was about to take out the trash. Thank you for listening to Human Monsters. Bye for now.